And no one ever mentioned the money supply, by the way. And the reason for that is a political thing. Big changes in the money supply cause big changes in the inflation rate. And sure enough, we were right, they were wrong. This happens every time you get a big inflation. The central bankers come out with some reasoning and rationale for the inflation. Something caused the inflation, but not us.
Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Karl Block. He'll be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Welcome to the show.
Professor Hanke, welcome to the Block and Tackle Show.
Great to be with you, Karl.
Thank you. So there's a lot to cover, and I almost feel like either the administration or the Fed or, frankly, countries around the world, they can't stop generating news that is right in your wheelhouse. But I think where I want to start today is, where do you see inflation going right now? What is your prediction? And I guess secondarily, because people seem to be conflating a lot of things, how do you feel tariffs are going to relate to inflation, and then what we're doing with tax policy?
Well, where we're going with inflation is determined by what's happened to the growth rate in the money supply a year or two ago. And what had happened then is that we had a contraction in the money supply, and that eventually, with a long lag, always leads to what? A fall in the inflation rate. So you have to remember, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. It's determined by these changes in the money supply. So inflation is at 2.4%. We're talking about the United States, of course. The
Sure.
United States inflation is 2.4%, and it is coming down. It's on a downward trend. And I think later this year, we'll probably see some numbers coming in very close to the 2% inflation target that's set by the Federal Reserve. So it's going down, and that's because the money supply has been contracting. So that's that aspect of it. It's confused and, as you say, conflated by all kinds of arguments that don't hold any water. One being that somehow tariffs are going to cause the rate of inflation to jump up. Now, tariffs, as they're imposed, they have an effect on prices. They change the price of things that are under the strong arm of tariffs. And they change those prices of those particular goods in relationship to other goods and services in the economy. They don't change the overall rate of inflation. They change the relationship between prices of tariffed goods and those that aren't tariffed. So that's where the confusion lies. And the same kind of thing and the same kind of argument came up, remember, in 2020 when COVID hit. The Fed goosed the money supply, started increasing the rate of growth in the money supply very dramatically. And we, of course, got inflation. And it happens, John Greenwood and I, who embrace the quantity theory of money, that's a model we use for forecasting or determining the course of the economy, meaning the course of nominal GDP, that includes two components, by the way, the real rate of growth in the economy and the inflation rate. We saw the inflation coming because of this big increase in the money supply, and sure enough, we got it. And so what did everybody else say? They said, oh, we have inflation, and we have that because we have supply chain glitches. Remember, that was a big deal in the COVID era, supply chain glitches, as lockdowns were occurring all over the world. And then some argued that what was increased price of crude oil, that was a cause. And this, that, and the other. There were lots of ad hoc reasons that were given to supposedly explain why. Remember, inflation was just transitory. That was another
I do remember
song and dance you were getting out of everybody. No one except Greenwood and myself and Tim Congdon in the United Kingdom ever said we use the quantity theory of money, and change the quantity theory of money. In short, says big changes in the money supply cause big changes in the inflation rate. And sure enough, we were right, they were wrong, and no one ever mentioned the money supply, by the way. And the reason for that is a political thing, and that is that the Federal Reserve is responsible for monetary policy and what goes on with the money supply in the economy. And there's no way the Fed ever wants to get roped in to the idea that they are in charge of monetary policy. They are in charge of where the money supply is going. And if the inflation goes up on their watch, they don't want that noose around their neck. They don't want a connection between them and the money supply and inflation. So this happens, by the way, every time you get a big inflation, the central bankers come out with some cockamamie reasoning and rationale for the inflation. Something caused the inflation, but not us.
Could you help me understand why they think they can get away with pretending that they're not responsible for the money supply? Is somebody else? Are there Martians who are responsible for the money supply? It's them. And I don't understand that. And I don't understand why they don't think that more money is more in the system is more likely to create inflationary activity, and less money is more likely to create potentially deflationary. I mean, I don't understand. I don't understand why they think people would disconnect what the Fed does as a central bank with monetary policy. I just don't get it.
Well, they do it because they get by with it. You have to remember, they don't want anyone talking about the money supply ever, period. And they don't want them talking about it because the Fed is responsible for controlling inflation. That's one part of the Employment Act of 1946. The other part is unemployment, controlling unemployment and controlling inflation. They have two aims or two objectives, but they don't want anyone having the money supply in the picture because they are the ones responsible for the money supply. So if you can get out of the picture what they're responsible for controlling and managing, then they haven't made, basically.
I mean, look,
No one can really critique them, and they have so much power over the press that we almost never see the money supply numbers even discussed in the press. Remember when Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the early 1980s, and he was trying to get inflation under control, and he, like myself, was paying attention to the money supply, trying to get it under control, because he knew if he got the money supply under control with tight monetary policy, inflation would disappear. And in those days, everyone paid attention to the money supply numbers. That was the first thing you looked at in the paper. They were the headline. And they were the headline because Volcker took on the task of killing inflation, and he wanted everyone looking at exactly what why he was squeezing the money supply. So he wanted it to be up front and visible. And Reagan was a president then, and Reagan didn't interfere. He let him do it. He said, Paul, this is your job. I want you to get wringing inflation out of the economy. You take charge with sound monetary policies and do it. And that's what Volcker did. And you got no complaints out of Reagan, by the way.
It just seems to be basic fundamental economics. And even during COVID, when the government was spending the trillions of dollars on COVID relief, what did they do, right? The money supply went up. They took actions to increase the money supply. The US government can't do that. Congress can't do it. The president can't do it. The Fed can do it. I hear you that that's their game. It's the most illogical game that you could possibly imagine. It just doesn't make sense.
So back to the period that you talked about with the COVID. So we shut down the economy. The fiscal deficit, the boom, because government spending went up. It didn't go down. And in the
Mhm.
meantime, tax revenues collapsed. The deficit was huge. And the Fed, then the Fed enters the picture. And they monetized over 90% of the deficit that was being generated at that time. And that means what? They were buying the Treasury securities that were being issued by the Treasury to finance the deficit. And when they do that, bingo, the money supply goes up because they buy the treasuries ultimately from the non-bank public, from you and me. And when they buy the treasuries from us, that means we give up those assets and get what? We get something in our checking account, to an asset to replace it. So we give up our treasuries, we sell them to the Fed, and the Fed fills our checking account in exchange. And when they fill a checking account, the checking account is a component of the money supply. So
Of
they
course.
increase the money. That's how it works. That's how it increases.
Sure.
And by the way, the biggest contributor to the money supply, who produces the money supply, it's really not the Fed, it's commercial banks. And these liquid deposits at the commercial banks account for almost 76% of the money supply measured by M2. So this is a mechanism that it works. The other thing I would add to complement what you said, Karl, is that I've looked historically, and if you look around the world historically, I have never found what I call a significant inflation. That's the inflation rate of 4% or more, lasting for 2 years or more. That if we use that definition of a significant inflation, I've never found one that wasn't preceded by significant increases in the money supply a year or two in advance of that inflation.
I mean,
It's pretty all very straightforward. Most people understand this if you explain it to them. The thing is, they don't see it in the press because the Fed doesn't want it in the press. You have to remember the government and the Fed are everything coming out of there. It isn't pure information. It's propaganda if they want it to be propaganda. So it's a spin factory. Washington, D.C. is a spin factory. And why do they get by with this? They get by with it at the Fed because most of the academic research that's produced in the United States, roughly 75% of it is produced by people who either work at the Fed or have worked at the Fed or receive research grants from the Fed. Now, those are kind of the high priest you see of money and banking. That's where the literature comes from. So if you go down at a lower level, a regular journalist, who are they talking to? Well, they're talking to people who are the high priest, who are producing most of the journal articles and books and things like that. So that's why the popular press, what you see in the popular press, is usually just rubbish. And it confirms always Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the financial press is either wrong or irrelevant.
listen, it makes sense. And I still get back to how I don't know, even somebody with just a rudimentary understanding of economics cannot grasp if there is more money in the system, you are more likely to create activities that will cause inflation. I just don't understand how you can avoid that fundamental fact. And the reverse being true, if you take too much money out of the money supply, you're going to curtail economic output. I don't get it. So,
Well, yeah, there's another aspect, by the way. You mentioned this new book that Matt Sikorski and I have done, Making Money Work. And one thing that we stress, we're trying to get the idea that, just what you said, get the quantity theory and money back in the picture, point number one. Point number two, get commercial banks back in the picture because commercial banks produce most of the money in the economy. They produce about 80% of money measured broadly by M2 or some more broad measure like M3 or M4. So that's part of what we're saying. We're also saying that monetary policy includes everything that affects commercial banks, as well as things that affect the central bank, as well as fiscal policy, because as I indicated before, fiscal policy can come into the picture if you have a deficit that gets monetized, for example. That's a perfect linkage.
Sure.
But we also indicate that monetary policy you want to keep the money supply growing at a fairly consistent level. And the level that's consistent with hitting a 2% inflation target in the United States for M2, that measure of money, it's 6.3%. Hanke's golden growth rate is 6.3%. If you had the money supply growing at a constant rate of 6.3% per year in the United States, you would have pretty close to inflation target being hit at 2% all the time. But we have another aspect in policy in this Making Money Work book, and that is you want monetary policy to be as neutral as possible. Now, if it's going up and going down, you got big problems with neutrality. For example, in COVID, the money supply shot up. At one point, actually, it peaked out. It was growing a little over 18% per year, the money supply measured by M2. That's the highest rate of growth that the money supply has ever registered since the Fed was founded in 1913. So the money supply went up. Well, what happens with that? We know from the quantity theory of money, if you get the money supply goosed, the next thing that happens with a very short lag, asset prices go up. So what did we have? We had a boom in the stock market. We had real estate prices going to the moon, land prices going to the moon, commodity prices went to the moon, and we had a very non-neutral effect on many things, many sectors of the economy, and on the income distribution in the United States. The percent billionaires' wealth as a percent of GDP in January of 2020, right before COVID started, was 14.1%. It now is 21.7% of GDP. So the rich became very rich because of the Fed policy of non-neutrality, this roller coaster, up, down, up, down, up. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Who owns all the assets? What assets? Even middle people, their balance sheets might be a net of zero. Rich people own all the assets. So if you artificially goose the value of assets with a big increase in the money supply, who benefits from that? Well, the rich do. And therefore, my conclusion is that probably the biggest distortion of income, the income distribution, and the magnification of income inequality in the United States was on the Fed's back. The Fed did this during the pandemic.
Okay, and that it makes perfect sense what you said. And I'm going to try to just say this. These are the same people who are criticizing the unpredictability of tariffs, but they don't care if there's not predictable or rational policy, meaning in really what you say, neutral policy in the money supply. And so, and I know you wrote another book about making money work. I mean, about capital interest and waiting. How do people plan when you have this uncertainty in what the money supply is going to be, and nobody can figure out how they decide when to change the money supply? They seem to focus on all these shiny objects, like you say, the price of oil, supply chain, all these things that, give and take. If a refinery blows up, if Walmart stops selling certain products, things that are normal, potentially, foreseeable things in commerce, instead of focusing on a stable or a consistent pattern of money supply. And I don't understand. And you've probably studied this, but if you're the CFO, if you're people who have to invest money, if you don't have predictability on anything, how do you do it?
Well, it all constrained. If you have bad monetary policy, and monetary policy, the part that's critical here, that Sakurki and I get into in the book Making Money Work, is that policies that affect banks, commercial banks, are very important for the reason that you're alluding to right now, and that is if we want policies that allow commercial banks to function more effectively and efficiently than they do right now. And what would that do? That would increase the number of bankable projects that could be financed by commercial banks. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you have a bankable project, that's a project that, the credit risk and everything get all evaluated by the bank. The bank makes a loan. That bankable project, that asset, you put it up as collateral for the loan. But that process of making the loan actually increases the money supply. And it does what? It increases also real economic activity because of the bankable project that's basically being underwritten by the commercial banks that are producing fiat money to finance the thing.
Sure.
So it allows the economy to grow at a more rapid and stable pace if you have good policies that are affecting the banks. Now, one thing that look like they're doing, they've got this supplemental liquidity ratio that is a burden on banks. It's an unnecessary thing. It requires the banks to hold what Sakurki and I think an unnecessary amount of liquid reserves. And when I say reserves, it would be like treasuries
Sure.
against their assets. So if they eliminate that regulation, which I think they will, by the way, it'll be a good thing because it will take the unnecessary straitjacket off the commercial banks, and they'll be able to finance more bankable projects, more good projects that are out there, but they're not being financed because the banks don't have the capacity to make the loans. And they don't have the capacity because they're required to have these supplemental liquidity ratios put on them.
Sure. And I have a feeling that the people who say, well, we don't want we're worried about bank failures, we're worried about banks making too many loans and overheating the economy. I'm not sure why they don't understand that for the most part, we've only gone through a couple of periods where banks have had very unstable situations. But why do you think that they're so afraid of reducing these liquidity requirements?
Well, they aren't afraid now. I think they're going to be removing them now. But
Okay,
the reason they came was the financial crisis of 2008. Remember
sure.
when Lehman went down, unnecessarily, by the way, Lehman went down. It was actually a solvent institution. And the US government, instead of lending liquidity to them, let them go under. And the reason for that, by the way, we happen to be, I think, a personal thing. And that is the Secretary of Treasury at the time didn't like the CEO of Lehman, and he just
Oh gosh.
let him go out to dry. But I have a colleague at Johns Hopkins, Larry Ball, who's written a definitive book on this, by the way. If you look at that, you will see why Lehman was solvent and should have been rescued. It's the government. This is what the lender of last resort facility should be all about. If someone is solvent and having a liquidity problem in the financial sector, the idea of the lender of last resort, the government, that function that they should be lending at a penalty rate to whoever that entity happens to be, instead of letting them go under as they did with Lehman. And then once Lehman went under, by the way, Lehman is not a bank.
Sure.
It wasn't a deposit taking bank. So people get all that. Bear Stearns wasn't a deposit lending bank either. But at any rate, what happened then is the following. Lehman went under. Washington gets in a huff and gets everything wrong as usual. And they say, Bankers caused this. Bankers caused the problem. Bankers caused these liquidity crisis, so forth and so on. And bankers are the bad guys, so we're going to have to put in legislation. So we had the Dodd-Frank bill. Remember that when that came in?
Of course.
And that put the banks in kind of a straitjacket with bank regulations. And then coincidentally, at the same time, by the way, you had international capital requirements being increased and coming out of Basel, Switzerland, the Basel III regular capital reserves, increasing the capital asset ratios of the banks. So all of this squeezed the banks. And the banks actually, when the crisis occurred, the bank credit actually went negative. The contribution of the banks was negative. They were draining from the system. So then what did the Fed have to do? Bernanke was the chairman of the Fed then, and they actually stepped in with quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. And if they wouldn't have, we would have had the following sequence. First mistake, Washington lets Lehman go under, a solvent institution. They let it die. That created the great financial crisis. And then we had Dodd-Frank and Basel III bank regulations, bad bank policy coming in, squeezing the commercial banks. The commercial banks stopped contributing to the growth of the money supply. They were actually draining it. And then the next thing that happened, we had to have quantitative easing, with the Fed having a massive increase in their balance sheet, the size of their balance sheet, that everyone was yelling and screaming about. But if we wouldn't have had that, with all these series of mistakes they made in Washington, ultimately the Fed did the right thing. We had quantitative easing 1 and 2 and 3. But that creates its own set of problems then. So it's just a cascade of wrong-headed things coming out of Washington.
Karl Block is both a corporate lawyer and a corporate restructuring partner. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as legal advice.
If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.